Hello, everyone, and welcome. I apologize for this getting to you on Thursday, but hopefully it will give you everything that you need. You, I think, had an assignment due tomorrow night at 11:59, and I may have that wrong on my schedule. Perhaps on the syllabus it's actually correct, but it is your leadership description in your for your movement, and I think I have it listed as being due this week, but it's not going to be due until next Friday for obvious reasons. I'm trying to look at the content right now. I've come to the conclusion that I'm really not very good with technology generally, but man, I'll tell you what, I'm already having problems with Brightspace, as you all know, and it's not getting any easier with how much online we actually have to do right now. So let me check the schedule here. Yeah, actually, I have it due by February 21st. So that would be tomorrow night. Scrap that. The assignment will be actually due next Friday at 11:59 for obvious reasons. Mainly the one that we didn't get to meet this week. So you didn't even get your lecture on leadership. So how would you be able to do that assignment? You wouldn't. So I will go in and I will change this on Brightspace for us, but it is now due February 28th, and this is the leadership style in your movements. All right, so in order for you to be able to do that little assignment, it's worth 50 points. It's just sort of a thing to let me know that you're still moving along in your paper. Let's go ahead and get started with talking about leadership and social movements. Due to the fact that we are not in the class together and you guys aren't able to ask me questions in real time, this will be a much shorter lecture. You'll notice that's because my lectures are very short, whereas my class discussions tend to be a little longer, obviously. So I prefer the former, or I prefer the latter, but we're stuck with the former, so here we go. The first thing it's probably important to understand is that there is a public perception of leadership and social movements, and that perception is not good. People don't view social movement leaders as in the right or helpful or sometimes even good. The reasons for this are pretty simple. I mean, we're disruptors, right? If you're the leader of a social movement, you're in opposition to something. So that means that you are trying to mess up the normal order of things, if you will. So they're unfavorable for the reason that not only that they're disruptors, that's the main problem, but they're viewed unfavorably because they don't do anything but complain. So that's number two, is that social movement leaders don't do anything except complain. Another reason why they're viewed unfavorably is because they're seen as revolutionaries. And the word revolution is never good. If you look at the French Revolution, they cut off heads. If you look at the Christian Revolution, they cut off heads. If you look at the Bolshevik Revolution, they filled people with bullets. This never ends well when there's a revolution in history. So that term revolutionary is supposed to be a little r revolutionary, meaning a description of people who want to change, not just evolve, but have quick change of a large mass audience. And unfortunately, whenever you say it's a revolutionary idea, people react badly to the word revolutionary. They think about it in terms of the big R, capital R, revolutionary, revolution. And then we start thinking about people like Napoleon or, like I said, the Bolshevik Revolution, Juan Perón, etc. It doesn't have a good view. Fourth, excuse me, the fourth reason why it's a problem is because the media will actually continue this portrayal of social movements and social movement leadership throughout. They will portray them as outsiders, foreigners, weirdos, if you will. For example, look at the Occupy movements. Now that started with Occupy Wall Street And I literally believe that was before you were born. And you look at Occupy Wall Street, you look at Occupy Democracy, you look at hippies. And when, by the time the 80s rolled around, they were called yuppies. There's a reason for this. People who can afford to be involved in social movements are people who have all of the other resources that they need, and they can focus on what we call higher order desires. They're not worried about getting food on the table, having a job, taking care of their kids, health care. They're less worried about those things, and they're more worried about things that movements focus on. Wall Street has too much control. The Democrats need more support. An art movement, for example, that is seen as a social movement. My social movement of U-Turn in Education, we are focused on book banning and freedom of speech and intellectual freedom. And those aren't, lower order or necessary for our lives. So if you are busy working hard, taking care of your family, you don't have time for these other things. Okay, so usually people who are leaders in social movements have the time, usually the energy. I don't have that one, but the time, the energy, the money, or at least the financial flexibility. In my case, for example, I don't have the money to start a nonprofit or something, or to even start a movement. I don't have that kind of lucrative finances, but what I do have is a steady job that frees up a lot of my time, and I can financially afford to drive across town or go wherever I need to, or reserve a room for a meeting. The truth of the matter is that social movement leaders, and we don't think about this a lot, but they're privileged in a lot of ways. Myself included. I will not even question that. And aside from the media, the fifth thing is that the institutions that you're fighting up against love this. They love the idea of a social movement being for outsiders only, because it allows them to construct you as a leader of a social movement as outside of the norm, as not to be listened to, as not a credible source of information. And that's incredibly problematic for some people. And for others of us, we're just like, yeah, that's me. I'm the kind of person that does that sort of thing. So social movement leaders have to understand what they're getting into. Leaders in social movements have multiple jobs. Their first and foremost job, you might think, is, it's the easy job, where they say, this is what we're going to do, and they give grand speeches. No, there are three leadership jobs, I'll put it that way. And the truth of the matter is no one social movement leader is good at all of these. There are exceptions to the rule. Martin Luther King Jr. is definitely an exception to the rule, and I'll talk about that in a second. But generally, you as a social movement leader usually do 2 out of 3 of these jobs. So let's talk about them. The first thing that they are is that they are organizers. This is the part where I think that a lot of we social movement leaders, and I'm only saying me as a leader because I'm labeled as the president or on the board of different various social movements that turned into nonprofits eventually, but organizing, not my thing. And we're not talking about, obviously, organizing like the papers and the finances. That's the treasurer's job. But we are talking about organizing in the field, as we call it. And this, by the way, is my weakest point as a political campaign advisor. You always need, if you hire me as a campaign manager, you need to make sure we have a good field organizer. And honestly, that's pretty true for a lot of campaigns, whether they're political or issue campaigns or social campaigns, okay? Organizers are important. And social movement leaders are viewed that way, mainly in the beginning, because social movement leaders are the ones who have to get out there and get people to follow them, to join in the fight, so to speak. The second thing that leaders are decision makers, and this is probably one of their biggest roles that not a lot of people think about. Social movements may look like they're doing everything everywhere all at once, but they're not. There are choices to be made. There are choices to be made, even in my statewide coalition, that movement for the right to read. We have to make decisions about what message we want to send and the timing of those messages, because you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to underplay it. You need to have the right tone and the right balance of messaging going to the correct outlets or channels for the specific time that you want to speak. So those decisions have to generally be made by, we like to say, oh, well, we're making it, right now I'm working with, on the coalition, I think that there are 14 members. We're talking about something that's happening in Christian County. We needed to talk about the timing of it. And all 14 of us agreed on the timing of it, but not before I was asked, what do you think is the good timing? Because I'm the one in the coalition with the knowledge about this particular county, right? If we were talking about St. Louis, I would just go along with whatever another consultant on the board or would say, on the steering committee, excuse me. I would go along with that. And that's basically what everyone does. But the leader had to say, okay, hey, Liz, what do you think is the best timing for this and the way to go about it? So the leader ultimately is the decision maker. And people don't like to acknowledge that. So we say, well, as a board, we've decided. And, sometimes it's just one person who made the decision, but got everybody else's approval. We've done that too, where obviously, if you have a board, a social movement president or leader can't just act. They have to ask the board for approval, and there has to be some evaluation of that approval. That's part of the organizing, really. And then last but not least, certainly not least, because this is probably the biggest role that social movement leaders have in the sense that it's the most visible. They are symbols for their movement. Now, I'll be honest with you, this is a double-edged sword. We might think, think of the great leaders of different movements. You have Martin Luther King, you've got Gandhi, you've got Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Trying to think of who else I want to mention here that is really just a symbol, well, not just a symbol, but is a symbol for a movement as much as anything else. I think that, I could make a pretty good argument for Eleanor Roosevelt. I think I could make a pretty good argument for a lot of the leaders who fought for the right of women and people of color to vote. Any of those people, I can make a good argument for them being symbols of a much larger movement. And that's helpful, but not every social movement leader attains that. Of course not. And if you think that Martin Luther King Jr. was doing on-the-ground field organizing when he became as popular and supported as he did when he was making his big speeches, then you're greatly mistaken. In the beginning, yes, but he had people all over the country who were helping him organize. One of those was actually Robert F. Kennedy. So don't confuse him with Junior. But he had help all over the country, sort of like tentacles going out in leadership roles. And so he also was shot and killed, as was RFK, as was Malcolm X, because they were symbols of what they were representing. And so if you kill the symbol, you kill the movement, right? That's usually wrong, thank goodness. But it does put a big dent and a big sort of hole in a social movement when its leadership is damaged like that. And how do you find a new leader? Well, for example, with Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott, his wife, she picked up the mantle and shared it with her kids. And then because they were such a large organization and they had that organization in place, they were able to keep working under the King name. And then his memory became a symbol. And that sort of carried on until today. He was voted, or not voted, but a bunch of we scholars got together and we said, hey, you know what? Let's figure out, because we were coming up on 2000, who the greatest speakers of the millennium were. And ultimately, I thought it might be John F. Kennedy for being best speaker, best speech, but actually it was Martin Luther King. His I Have a Dream speech, which totally makes sense. I mean, that's something that we all quote a lot. It's something that is a symbol. And so, well, and he also was an incredibly charismatic speaker, which John Kennedy was good and formulaic and very clear, but I don't know that he was as inspiring as Martin Luther King Jr. So we went with it. And here's why. Okay, so I just told you that leaders are organizers, decision makers, and symbols. For me, I wanted to bring it up that everybody in Christian County associates me with, I'm going to give you the real name and then the derogatory name. So the name of my organization is U-Turn in Education. They call it leftist indoctrination. We include DEI, especially trying to protect LGBTQIA plus youth. We are called, which word do I want to pick? I've been called a lot of things. Smut peddler, pedophile, groomer. Groomer is the one I get the most often. And yeah, those are the names I'm going to give out right now. In other words, you as a symbol have to take on the negative representation that will be assigned to you without choice. I mean, gosh, if I was going to pick something to be called, groomer would not be it, right? They label us, and I'm not kidding here, and I am an ally, but I myself am not LGBTQ, or I am an ally, and therefore we get called alphabet people, which is probably one of the most offensive things, not for me, whatever, but for particularly the students I work with in Nixa High School. It's offensive to everybody. It's a member of the community. It's offensive to the community, but it's offensive, in so many ways. And to say that because I am the president of U-Turn for Education, that's what I am, is kind of like, well, you're sort of missing the point, right? And so at the point where somebody becomes a symbol for the movement is the point where they're at risk. And that's why, and I don't feel like my life is at risk. It has been threatened a few times, but I don't think anybody would actually do it because these people also claim to be Christians. So let's hope not. But some people who claim to be Christians are the ones who killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, who, by the way, were all killed in the same 5-year period. John in 63, Robert and Martin Luther King Jr. in 68, I believe. They were all seen as linked, as fighting for people of color, as fighting for equity and equality, as fighting for sort of those liberal ideas that a lot of people think of. Writing this lecture made me think of something that I wanted to explain to you all too, and I'll do it here. There is a difference between liberals and libertarians. A lot of people get those confused. They don't understand, they're both focused on individuals, on individual rights, right? Sort of. A liberal is usually put in sort of contention or conflict or opposition with a conservative, all right? So liberal ideas are considered to be free thinking, bending the rules, breaking the rules, redoing the rules, disruptive, all of those things. Whereas conservative literally means that you want things to stay the way they are. That's what true conservatism is. And I don't mean stuck and not making progress. I mean that we want to follow the rules of the Constitution, that we want to keep the general practices of Congress together, for example, that traditionally bills, that we fight about in Congress, traditionally, not now, but before, what we fought about in Congress were the details of how things were going to get accomplished, not if they were going to get accomplished, okay? And that's a very good battle to have. It's incredibly informative. It's the way we functioned for 250 years. It's fantastic. However, the other side of that, libertarian, literally wants the government out of their lives. In fact, one of the bigger mistakes I think of scholars in viewing 2024's election cycle is that they think people are voting for or against democracy. And that wasn't how they saw it. Yeah, I mean, that may have been true, but that's not how they saw it. They saw it as completely upending the government and getting rid of it. And I've always said, what replaces that? And I've talked about my friend, I think, James, who works for Sky News, which is very, very right wing. And he's in Australia, and he studied this stuff for a long time. And he goes, "What's wrong with you?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" He goes, the only thing that can fill a space in a democracy is an authoritarian regime. You know that. Historically, that's what happens. And so that's where that argument of you're voting against democracy comes from. Because, and you know what? That argument didn't work. And I'm not really all that surprised that it didn't work, except I'm more surprised that I didn't see it coming. I think a lot of media and communication scholars are like, how do we miss that one? And it really wasn't until late in the fall semester of last year that I learned this, that the first idea of it was brought to me by someone. I'm like, wow, okay. So I said, well, what do we put in its place? Just chaos? And that person couldn't answer. And I think the reason why they couldn't answer is because what James said is true. The only thing that could fill the void once a democracy falls is an authoritarian regime. You need to be told what to do. And so all of a sudden, those libertarians aren't getting what they thought they wanted. And you know what? It's happened before. It'll happen again. And if, rather than comparing it to Hitler or Pinochet or Perón or Pol Pot, how about if we compare it to the Roman Empire? When democracy fell, when the republic fell, is when the authoritarian regime of an empire began. So it's, a lot of us see the Roman Empire as very successful, as a good thing. Not me, by the way, but a lot of people do. And so that's actually what they wanted. And so, no, they didn't want democracy. They just didn't know how to word it. And that's okay. If that's what people want, that's what people want. Now, I'm not going to get into, the numbers here. I do think it's kind of silly that people keep saying that Trump has a mandate, that we overwhelmingly voted for him. I kept saying fewer than 4 million votes. I'm hearing that it was actually like 2 million. That's not a lot when you consider how many millions of people vote in this country. It's not a lot. It doesn't mean you didn't win. It just means the numbers aren't there to claim that you overwhelmingly have a mandate. So I think it's important for people to understand the distinction in liberal thought and libertarian thought. And the reason why I think that's important is because I don't want people to confuse individual rights and not wanting any rule of law at all. I don't want people to really confuse those. So I just thought I'd clarify that today. I don't know what made me think of that, except that they say that a leader has to have 3 things in a social movement. And when I read these, they're pretty scary. And I'll tell you why. So the 3 leadership characteristics that you generally need to have, and you'll notice I don't have all these, by the way. 1 is charisma. 2, prophecy. Yeah, you heard me say that, prophecy. I'll talk about that. And finally, pragmatism. All right. Now, let's talk about this. Charisma. I don't know that anybody would say that I'm particularly charismatic. I don't think how is it you guys say it these days? I don't have a lot of riz, or no riz. I don't know, whatever it is I'm supposed to say. I don't have a whole heck of a lot of charisma. And when I think of charisma, I think of people making big, sweeping speeches that inspire others. Like, I don't know, Barack Obama, right? Or in our current world, Donald Trump. And we can question a lot of things about Donald Trump, but the one thing we can't question is that he has a lot of charisma, okay? It's incredibly important that we not sort of miss that. Prophecy, what prophecy really is not, oh, you can predict the future, but rather that you're able to explain what the future can be like if your movement is successful. So you're able to say, look, this is what's coming down the pike. This is what we don't want. This is what we do want. Work with us. I only have a little bit of that. a lot of my public speeches are more about trying to stop what's happening than it is about helping to predict the future or helping to prophesize about how great things could be if we don't ban books. I do it sometimes, but it's not a lot. Finally, pragmatic. And this is where I come in more than anything, is you have to be able to say, this is how movements work. These are the things we need to do to organize. These are the messages that we need to send internally to our organization and externally to the public. And those are 2 completely different messages, because to the people who've already bought in, that's not a hard sell. But to the people who are outside of the movement, that is an incredibly hard sell. So you have to be pragmatic about how it is that you go through not just the organization, but also not just the organization, but also the messaging strategies that you use. Obviously, we're talking about persuasive messaging, but what do we mean by that? How are we going to do it? What works better? For a long time, we started out with business cards that had a QR code that go to our website. And I required that we made up bookmarks. Why bookmarks? Because our first focus was books. And I wanted people to associate something that they could hold in their hand with the message that we were trying to send. And so bookmarks are what really, I thought stuck really, really well. Okay, next up, I just want to wrap up, my computer rebooted and decided to get rid of where my notes were, and that's really awkward. Better yet, I don't think that I was saving. But I know that I've only got one more subject matter for you today, and that's one that I know a lot about. I'm not worried about having notes, but there are, generally speaking, 3 types of leadership styles, generally. All right, so you probably know these already. The first is democratic, and a democratic style of leadership involves wanting to keep the group together as much as getting the job done. So you're focused on the goal, but you're also focused on keeping people happy. And that means you have to have some sort of social continuity. We have to have social meetings. Otherwise, we would lose all of our members, right? The volunteers would just slip away, because you don't want to be doing something just to do the job. That is work. And you're not getting paid. So what you want to know is that you are part of that bigger group. Remember, I said social movements are about identity. You want to know that you belong. Okay? So a democratic leader gets people together, gets them unified, and motivates them to act. The autocratic leader, autocratic, literally auto, meaning A-U-T-O, meaning that it's doing itself, it's functioning on its own, right? Autocorrect on your phone is literally fixing things for you. It's not asking you what you want. It doesn't care if you like it. It just gets done. Autocratic leadership doesn't just mean one person's in charge or something like that. What it means is that there is no need for participation from the group. So you don't need the group's input. You don't need people saying, here's what we should be doing, or here's what I think, or God forbid, doing things on their own that clearly are within the group's values, but they were not told or ordered to do it. So it's not automatic. That is what literally autocrat means. Now, there are obviously different kind of democracies. You've got democratic republics. You've got democratic monarchies. You have, I think we still call it a democratic monarchy because of parliament, if I recall correctly. There are different types of democracies out there. There are different types of autocrats. Yes, obviously the first thing we think of is a dictator, but there are other kinds of autocratic rules as well that aren't considered a dictator, but are more considered so accepted by the people that they are trying to lead that it doesn't function as a dictatorship. It functions as I don't know what word to use here. The word I want to use is cult, but I don't want it to be like a bad cult. It's a cult that people want to buy into. So a good cult, I guess, is the only way that I could think to word that. Last but not least is laissez-faire, which is spelled, that's the only reason why I needed my notes, honestly. L-E-I, sorry, no, ignore that. I believe it's L-A-I-S-S-E-Z and then there's a hyphen, FAIRE, FAIRE. And you know, I hate when I can't remember how to spell things, so I'm going to make sure I have that right for you. Sure I am. Somewhere in here it exists. Here we go. LAISSEZ hyphen FAIRE. I had it right. That is a French word that literally means like hands off. A leader who just, I don't know, maybe they're a symbol, but they don't do any of the other things that generally we expect a leader to do. They don't work to make people work together. They don't function as a, authoritarian, this is how we get it done. They're not doing any of that. They're sitting back and letting the group do what the group does. And you know what? Sometimes you can have a laissez-faire attitude towards your group. I mean, I have it sometimes, I'll be like, hey, you guys decide this one. It's not my area. Right now, we're looking at sunshine laws that were violated by the Christian County Library Board. Not my area. But there are people on my board who that's all they do is study that stuff. So I'm like, yeah, you guys do that. I'll be over here. Let me know what comes up. That might be more considered a division of labor. But when you're the president, you're supposed to have eyes on everything. And I don't. So some of that might be considered a little bit laissez-faire. But for the most part, I would have to say that definitely democratic. If a decision needs to be made, I make one. But very rarely do we come to that because most of the time, the whole group, but particularly the board of 8 people agree. So what did we learn today? Well, we learned about the perceptions of leaders and groups, why they might have a bad reputation. We've learned about the different types of leaders, the qualities that they need to have, and how they function in a social movement. Hopefully, this will give you enough information to go and write, a page or two for 50 points about the leadership styles or structures or whatever in your movement. And you are welcome to find outside sources of information and bring it in. I used some today. I'm going to ask you to make sure that you put a reference page on there. If you do use some outside support, that's totally fine. For me, my main use of support is by a book by Stewart Smith and Denton. I'm just telling you this so that you know that I do what I say I'm going to do. This book right here, which is a book I almost had you guys get, but I decided that I would just try to do this on my own because I only use a few chapters out of this. I don't read the whole thing or use the whole thing, and then I end up using other sources. But I want to let you know that for today, most of the information came from Stewart Smith and Denton. And anyway, any questions, comments, concerns, etc., text me, email me, let me know how you're doing, make sure that you're alive. Anyway, have a good and safe weekend. Don't do anything crazy until we get back to class on Tuesday. I'll see you then.